welcome back to Vinyl Friday, where I go through my records in alphabetical order like a big nerd and talk about why I love them. We've had a number of newcomers to this channel recently, so if you are new here, welcome. If you are old here, also welcome. This used to be a weekly journey through the alphabet of my record collection, but with the Revolver Odyssey every second week and the Rumors Mill on the first Friday of the month, there's really only 1 week a month now where we're actually continuing through the alphabet, and this is that week. We're up to the letter G. Today we're listening to the Grateful Dead. In a way, this is kind of like a sister episode to the one about the Byrds and the Beatles and how they invented rock, in that it's a story about a moment of rapid and dramatic evolution in the landscape of Western music. It's also about how that evolution was in large part down to artists being in constant conversation with each other. Whereas the last episode was about an expansive broadening of the bounds of genre and of musical creativity, this is an episode that is more about the end of an era and a return to basics. That seems a good place to start. Let's start! So this is what music looked like in 1964.
There she was, just walking down the street singing. Round, round, get around, I get around, yeah. Needles and midnight. My baby was you let me hold your hand. I wanna hold your bits and pieces. Since you left me to say goodbye.
And this is what music looked like in 1967.
Hey, Carrie Ann, what's your game? Now can anybody go ask Alice? Oh, hello, Mr. Soul, I dropped by to pick up a green tambourine.
So what the fuck happened? Well, this may seem like a non sequitur, but I swear it is actually related. It'll be meandering, but we'll get there in the end. Here we go. In 1936, a Swiss chemist named Albert Hofmann first synthesized a substance called LSD. He was trying to create a sort of respiratory and pulmonary pharmaceutical stimulant, but it didn't work, so he abandoned it. 7 years later, he thought, I'm going to come back to that. There's something in it, and I'm not sure what it is. He accidentally absorbed some, presumably through his skin, while he was handling it, resulting in his discovery of psychoactive effects of the substance, and also the most unusual bicycle ride of his life. I was already deep in LSD inebriation, and one of its characteristics, just on this bicycle trip, was of not coming from any place or going any place. There was absolutely no feeling of time. We'll go now to our psychedelic correspondent, who will outline a few more of those psychoactive effects. Right, so reported symptoms include okay, maybe now's not the best time. That's okay, I can cover this. Reportedly, one of the effects is the feeling that time has slowed down and stopped. Seeing things that might seem completely ordinary in a very novel light. Some people might experience synesthesia, which is sort of a melding of different senses, so they might be able to see music or feel visual art. I closed my eyes and had beautiful colored visions. There was a transformation of every sound into an optical figure. Each noise produced a corresponding colored figure, which was very enjoyable. Some might experience euphoria. Some might experience terror. The substance was picked up by the psychiatry community, who thought it might have therapeutic potential. And it also caught the eye of the CIA, who, in an attempt to create novel and exciting ways of torturing people, accidentally birthed a cultural revolution. This sounds insane, but it is in fact the truth. This mind control project was called MK Ultra.
Dr. Cameron pursued a concept he called depatterning, which was meant to reduce patients to an infantile psychological state wherein doctors could take advantage of the person's cognitive vulnerability to attempt to rebuild their mind under the doctor's control.
Through that program, LSD was administered to, among a multitude of others, with and without their consent, 2 volunteer research subjects who were quite notable within the art community: poet Allen Ginsberg, who wrote Howl, and author Ken Casey. I think it's pronounced Casey. He wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. The latter was so moved by the experience that he formed a group called the Merry Pranksters, took a school bus, slapped a whole lot of different colors of paint on it, and embarked on this kind of reverse Manifest Destiny road trip to spread the good word about LSD. They put on these events called acid tests. Yes, exactly, of Electric Kool-Aid acid test fame, in which there would be light shows, projections, live music, and everyone would drop acid together. I just realized I forgot to mount the microphone. University students and hipsters hopped on this proverbial bus, and from there, of course, artists across the spectrum who started to adopt elements of their own psychedelic experiences into their art and really infuse it, inspired by their visual hallucinations, the creative inspiration of seeing things in a new way, or just trying to capture the feeling. This, of course, translated to revolutionary shifts in fashion, in visual arts, and of course in music. It became heavier, became more progressive, became more inclusive of other genres, became more playful. All of these ideas are things that we're exploring in the Revolver Odyssey about the Beatles' experience of this time. So if you're looking for more information about that, this is a good place to go for it. And in San Francisco, at the center of all this, was the Grateful Dead.
I've got a friend somewhere.
The Grateful Dead formed in the mid-1960s, but all of the members had come from their own diverse musical backgrounds. Several of the members brought to the band a strong musicality, and together they formed this fairly innovative approach to live music. It was sort of inspired by jazz in that there were these long improvisations in which the members would listen to each other, read each other, and together build something different with every performance. This is one of the reasons that there is an enormous library of Grateful Dead concert recordings, bootlegs, etc. Another is that they actively encouraged people to bootleg their concerts. So members of that group are Jerry Garcia, Bob Weir, Pigpen McKernan, great name, Phil Lesh, Mickey Hart, who am I forgetting? Bob Kreutzmann. Oh, and they had a lyricist who was not a performer with the band, but who wrote lyrics with them and thus was considered a member of the band. So they were kind of unusual in that respect. They also had 2 drummers, which is cool as hell. And when I say that they were central to the counterculture psychedelic movement in the Bay Area, I mean that fully. That lyricist, Robert Hunter, I don't know if I said his name before, was one of the participants in the MK Ultra experiments with LSD. They all lived together in the Haight-Ashbury area, which was arguably the epicenter of the counterculture movement in San Francisco. They were the live act at a lot of the acid tests. The guy who did their sound engineering and designed their logo was Owsley Stanley, who was pivotal in the San Francisco area and in the history of the counterculture movement because he was the first private individual, as far as everyone knows, who was able to mass manufacture LSD. He estimates that he produced approximately 5 million doses between 1965 and 1967. He's actually the subject of the Steely Dan song Kid Charlemagne, for what it's worth. So they were right in the thick of it. And in their psychedelic heyday, they sounded like this. Predictably, I wasn't there at the time, but I get the impression that this was a period in Western history that was defined by optimism, by idealism, by the sense of infinite possibility for things to get better. Which, speaking from personal experience, doesn't seem like something my generation gets a whole lot of, and I would imagine that the next generations to come feel approximately the same way. But, you know, if you were there, I'm happy for you. It seems like it was a good time. Unfortunately, in late 1967, the wheels began to fall off. The Haight-Ashbury area had sort of become a tourist attraction, so all these kind of day trippers were flocking to the area, cosplaying as hippies, and then going back to their normal, straight lives.
You know, I went to Haight-Ashbury expecting it to be this brilliant place, and it was just full of horrible, spotty, drop-out kids on drugs.
Understandably, though, it made it a much less pleasant place for those who actually lived there. And in late 1967, an anarchic performance artist group called the Diggers held a funeral procession for the Summer of Love. Several months after this, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and a lot of the American elders in my life described this as being a moment where the bubble burst for them, and that sense of idealism that they had had was ripped away. LSD is being outlawed, so where previously it was this thing that you could just get and take, now it's becoming an illegal substance. And near the end of the decade, there was kind of a backlash to the hippie movement because the Manson murders had taken place and Charles Manson had insisted that he had received the permission or advice, if you will, to commit these murders after listening to songs from the Beatles' White Album. And on top of that, the Altamont Festival, which was put on by the Rolling Stones and in large part by the Grateful Dead, was intended to be this event that celebrated the counterculture and was almost like a continuation of Woodstock, and it ended tragically, to say the least. Went really badly, not a great success. And in the music scene, a lot of the big players were experiencing similar crises, tragedies, etc. The Beatles' manager died at the end of 1967. They also put out this fantastical, flamboyant, uber psychedelic film called Magical Mystery Tour, which flopped, perhaps in large part because it was intended to look like this, but it was broadcast on the BBC like this. And the Beach Boys, who had only very recently put out this psychedelic masterpiece, were beginning to fall from grace, and Brian Wilson, who had spearheaded Pet Sounds, and who was the sort of genius behind the band, was starting to have some serious mental health struggles. Bob Dylan, who wasn't necessarily a psychedelic pioneer, but had certainly taken part in this heavier rock experiment, had a motorcycle accident and sort of became a recluse for a long time. He spent his period of convalescence at his house in Woodstock, New York, didn't tour, didn't do interviews, renounced the public entirely. The Byrds had kicked out David Crosby, Buffalo Springfield imploded, the Mamas and the Papas imploded, LSD began to go out of vogue and was replaced by harder things like cocaine, and that notably changed the energy of the scene. It became a lot less welcoming and open. Maybe the sense of idealism felt thwarted or naive. In my opinion, it is the combination of these factors that forced a lot of these musicians to withdraw or retreat and start working on things that felt a bit less daring, a bit more comfortable, less hubris and more humility, a return to basics, a return to their roots and to simplicity. The Beatles went on a retreat to India where they wrote a whole lot of acoustic songs, and following that project decided to go back to their earliest roots as a rock and roll band with the Get Back sessions. While Dylan was in Woodstock, he invited his band, the band. They wrote a whole bunch of music together, which resulted in the Basement Tapes.
Ooh, baby,
Bob Dylan put out an album called John Wesley Harding. It was a lot more acoustic, a lot more folky, very heavy on the country influence.
John Wesley Harding was a friend to the poor.
The band themselves put out an album of fairly rustic tracks.
take a load off Fanny.
The Byrds' sons, David Crosby, put out a country album called Sweetheart of the Rodeo. And Graham Parsons and Chris Hillman of that band defected, formed a new band called the Flying Burrito Brothers, and just went head first into country rock. And what was left of Buffalo Springfield and the Hollies and the kicked out member of the Byrds got together and formed Crosby, Stills Nash. They put out in 1969 one of my all-time favorite albums, a collection of songs which are stellar, and largely acoustic.
You don't have to cry.
So all of these bands that had only very recently been making bold, big, flamboyant choices in their music had suddenly decided to shut up shop there and just get out their acoustic guitars and do something quiet and simple for a change. The Grateful Dead was one of those bands. They went back into the studio and they recorded 2 albums back to back, Working Man's Dead and American Beauty. Now, I don't have Working Man's Dead, or I would treat this as a double album episode because they were recorded 4 months apart and they are both equally a rejection of the sort of big psychedelic stuff that they had been doing recently. Both albums earned places on Rolling Stone's 500 Greatest Albums of All Time, basically every iteration of that list. Both of the albums mellowed that kind of psychedelic high that the band's previous albums had been on. And American Beauty sounds like this.
Do we all fall down in a little beauty addicts of my chugging? Got my chips cashed in, keep chugging.
So you see, it's kind of, again, rustic, folky, country, very Americana. Jerry Garcia has acquired a pedal steel guitar at some point, and that is all over this album. There's a bit of mandolin, whole lot of acoustic guitar. And in the case of Jerry Garcia, he kind of cut his teeth playing bluegrass and being in jug bands. Like the Grateful Dead, in one of their earlier iterations, was a jug band. So in a way, this isn't something new. This is a homecoming of sorts. Drummer Mickey Hart said, and I quote, "This was sort of stepping out of our spacesuit and coming down to earth and putting on a pair of Oshkosh and digging the furrows." You can even see it in the album covers. Like, this is the cover of the previous album, whose name I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce. Whereas Working Man's Dead is in sepia, the anti-psychedelic. But also it kind of recalls, for me at least, farmlands and the Dust Bowl and salt of the earth types. And this one is very similar. It's got this beautiful wooden background. It has a stylized painting. It's actually an ambigram, so it reads the same upside down and right side up. American Beauty. Well, allegedly it's an ambigram. I'm not seeing it. Maybe it's like one of those magic eye things and you have to... No, I'm still not seeing it. That previous album, whose name I still don't know how to pronounce, had taken ages to record. It was a massive project because the band had gotten their hands on one of these new 16-track recorders and gotten a little bit too ambitious with it. Tried to stack way too many things on top of each other, and the music had suffered as a consequence. They actually had to go back and record the entire thing. All up it took like 6 months. It got them massively in debt with their record company. And so when the time came to record the next album, Working Man's Dead, and this one, Jerry Garcia said, and I quote, "Let's do it all in 3 weeks and get it the hell out of the way." Hear, hear, sir. American Beauty was made in a very similar vein, but with a greater emphasis on vocal harmony, which we'll get into very, very shortly. Actually, we'll get into it right now. Hell. What's stopping us? I said at the top of the episode that this is also a story about artists in conversation with each other. So we're going to dig into that a little bit more now. All of those artists that I mentioned before, at the same time, did this dramatic about-face and radically changed their approach to music. And they didn't, in my view, do this completely organically. They did this because they were all looking to and listening to each other's work. And while there were other artists in the Grateful Dead constellation while they were recording this album and the one before it, like Jefferson Airplane and Santana. The one that I think is most important to focus on is Crosby, Stills Nash. And not only because I think that Crosby, Stills Nash is one of the greatest bands the world has ever seen. Bias aside, I still think they're important to this story. And the Grateful Dead think so too.
What sort of made that? It was any influence to do that, the shift towards from the anthem era sort of to
Crosby, Stills, and Nash.
In the summer of 1968, Stephen Stills is departing from Buffalo Springfield, which was basically imploded by that point. So he spent 3 months living with Mickey Hart, drummer for the Grateful Dead, at his ranch. Because he was befriending David Crosby, my king, at that point in time, Cros was coming over all the time and they were jamming. Mickey Hart says, and I quote, "He and David Crosby really turned Jerry and Bob onto the voice as a holy instrument. That turned us away from pure improv and more into songs." David Crosby added to that, "When you hang out with other musicians to cross-pollinate your idea streams, that naturally happened between us on a level that was very rare." The recording of these albums overlapped with the recording of Deja Vu by Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. If I Could Only Remember My Name, David Crosby's solo debut. Songs for Beginners, Graham Nash's debut.
I remember better days.
And Stephen Stills' debut.
And there's a rose in the twisted love.
More than that, they were all in the same studio between about 1969 and 1971, Wally Heider's studio in San Francisco. A bunch of them were also experiencing a great deal of grief at the time. Jerry Garcia's mom had just died in a car accident. Phil Lesh's dad had just died of cancer. Mickey Hart's father hadn't died, but in his capacity as the band's manager, had run away with a good deal of their money. I think there's a degree of grief that you would experience in that. Meanwhile, David Crosby's girlfriend had died in a car accident of her own at the end of 1969. I cannot find the source now, but I have read in numerous places that they all attest to the fact that playing music together was deeply meaningful and therapeutic for them, and it really helped them all heal from that grief that they were experiencing together in tandem. So they're all together. They're very much in an emotional headspace, and they're cross-pollinating. They're borrowing ideas from each other. David Crosby said that he loved what the Grateful Dead was doing with weird time signatures, started to incorporate that into their music. And the Grateful Dead played on all of those Crosby, Stills, Nash Extended Universe albums that I just mentioned. Here, have a montage!
I used to be a king,
So we changed partners.
Equally, Crosby, Stills, Nash's fingerprints are all over this album. I'll show you a few examples from my favorite track on the album, Till the Morning Comes.
Till the morning comes.
I love this song. You know, I was never a huge fan of jam bands. It just was not my jam. But I read somewhere, probably the 1001 albums you must listen to before you die book, that on this album, the Grateful Dead sounded like Crosby, Stills, Nash. And I was like, well, hell, I'll give them a try. And I'm glad I did, because I really enjoy this album. I don't think that they do vocal harmony as well as Crosby, Stills, Nash, which obviously was their trademark, but they give it a really good shot. So straight off the bat, even if you had no idea that these guys have been spending so much time with Crosby, Stills, and Nash, the harmonies are a dead giveaway.
Don't think about what you left behind.
Get it? It's the title of the episode. But that just has Crosby, Stills, Nash written all over it. Like, yeah, if you take that little vocal part,
Don't think about
doesn't that sound like this?
so badly I must cry out loud.
Yes, it does. Also, this song has a coda. The verses sound like this.
Till the morning comes.
And then there's this other bit that I don't think is quite a chorus, but that sounds like this.
Tell you what I'll do.
That just repeats back and forth, A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B, until the end, where it goes in a completely different direction here. I don't know if you can tell, but that's my favorite part of the song. And to me that sounds kind of like the end of Sweet Judy Blue Eyes. The do-do-do-do-do bit. With a sort of dual lead element where one of them's in 3-part harmony and one of them is a single lead. But also, Crosby, Stills Nash is a band that really plays around with form. So you don't just have your standard first chorus, middle eight, chorus, maybe double chorus. You might have something like a suite, like Sweet Judy Blue Eyes, that has A, B, C, D parts and they all flow together. Or 49 Bye-Byes, which starts as a waltz
49 reasons
and ends as something entirely different. Deja Vu, which begins here and ends here. And so on and so on. There are so many examples. I feel like Grateful Dead is really borrowing from that on this track. Oddly enough, I think there are also echoes of the earlier works of the individual members of Crosby, Stills Nash. For instance, there are little bits that sound almost Birds-y. And Birds' harmonies aren't exactly the same as Crosby, Stills Nash harmonies. I hear it especially in this line. Doesn't that sound like this? So yeah, you can really hear how they're interacting with each other, and to me, that is so magical. I may have said a similar thing in the Birds and Beatles episode, but I just love to hear about members of musical communities coming together and sharing with each other, because music is meant to be shared, and there is so much to learn from your peers as musicians. It is such a beautiful thing to hear that they were friends and that they were being so generous with their time and their knowledge and their creativity. It's a beautiful love story. And to me, it's kind of a shining light that counterbalances the tragedy of a generation of young people having their idealistic dreams ripped to shreds. Maybe that's the pessimist in me saying it that way. If you were there, weigh in. Was it like that, or is it just how the history books are coloring it? What was it actually like being there? Whichever way you spin it, you can hear in these pastoral, less ornate tracks the sounds of psychedelia and all of the maximalism that comes with it meeting its demise. For a moment anyway. Psychedelic music never really dies. And as I mentioned in the Birds and Beatles episode, there has always been some iteration of psychedelic rock since the 1960s in popular music. For what it's worth, there's also been a renaissance recently in research of psychedelic substances, so who's to know the shape of psychedelic rock to come? Before we close out, I feel like there was a lot of talking and a lot less music than I might usually include in these episodes, so quickly I just want to take you through some of my favorite moments on this song. First off, that B section has a very sophisticated chord sequence, mysterious and sexy.
You're my woman now, make yourself easy.
The ride cymbal in that section of the song right at the end. Check this out. Yes! Mickey Hart or Bill Kreutzmann or whoever that is what the ride cymbal is there for. And of course the coda. It's so joyful. So there seems to be some sort of like xylophone or something going ham at the end of the song. I think it's a xylophone, could be a triangle. Ding 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 ding. I'm not a very good triangle or xylophone. It's just become abundantly obvious. And that's it from me. If you enjoyed this episode or you would like to support any of the weird things that I do, I'll leave a link in the description to my Buy Me a Coffee page, where you are most welcome to make a donation, but no pressure, friends. Thank you so much to everybody who has made a donation. I appreciate you so very much. Remember, Beatles next week. Looking forward to it. Thanks for hanging out with me. I'll see you here next week. Have a great weekend! Last week, some not especially kind person in the comments said that my arms spasm while I'm talking. It is what it is, I guess. another reported effect is memory loss. From any place or going anywhere. Hi. We are so fortunate to have been granted a place on this fantastic planet. Lucky us.